And the talk today, the theme of the talk today is on awakening to our deepest freedom. The heart, awakening is at the heart of the Buddha's teachings. And so I'll share some reflections on that. And then, depending on time, we'll have some questions, sharing, and announcements to finish. So I'm glad you could be with us today and hope your weekend is going well. And let's begin with a period of meditation. So just finding your way to a comfortable posture. It's helpful to sit with your back straight, letting the shoulders be as relaxed as possible. Letting your hands rest wherever they're comfortable, in your lap or on your knees or on your thighs. And if you're comfortable, you might let your eyes close, and let your awareness come inward. If you prefer, you could keep your eyes open with a soft, unfocused gaze. But just letting the attention come into the body. And you might just notice what's present as we begin today. Notice whatever's here in the body and mind, heart. You might take a few longer, deeper breaths to help you just settle into being here. So a nice, full, deep in-breath, filling the chest, filling the lungs, and releasing long, slow out-breath. Breathing in, calming the body. Breathing out, calming the mind. Letting your breathing help you settle, relax into being here. You might consciously put to one side thoughts about the future, plans, things to do, things that might happen, and also things from the past. Just let yourself be as fully present as you can be right now with your experience. You might invite a smile or half smile to your face. Just feeling the muscles around the eyes and around the mouth relaxing. Maybe thinking of someone or something that makes you feel happy or joyful. And the smile sends a message to our brain and to our nervous system that we can be at ease, that we can relax. Just relax into being here. Letting the smile be an expression or an attitude of how you want to meet whatever comes up, whatever's present. And you might bring your awareness to your breathing, just a light awareness of breathing in and breathing out. And as you are aware of your breathing, in breath and out breath, you might also at the same time invite an attitude of friendliness and kindness to your own experience. So whatever is here right now for you, see if you can make space for it. Just allow this moment to be just as it is. Breathing in, just knowing that you're breathing in. Breathing out, knowing that you're breathing out. If it's helpful, you could make a light mental note of in for the in breath and out for the out breath. Or rise and fall as the chest and belly rise on the in breath and fall on the out breath. Just meeting whatever is present with an attitude of kindness and acceptance. Saying yes to whatever is present. The Sufi poet Rumi speaks of welcoming the guests in his poem, The Guest House. He says, welcome the guests, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still Treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. He says the dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. So if that's a helpful image, guests coming to visit, just inviting an attitude of acceptance, of welcoming, of friendliness to whatever is arising in the body, the heart, the mind. If you notice your attention has gone off into the future, the past, daydreams, memories, plans, worries, just gently and kindly let your attention come back. Invite the attention back to the body, to the breath, to this moment. Is there anything in the way of being at peace in this moment, just as it is, with whatever's present for you? Can this moment be a moment of peace, a moment of freedom? If you find the mind responds by saying, I could be peaceful if I didn't have this ache in my back or this feeling of restlessness, you might then just ask, is it possible to be at peace in the midst of the ache or the restlessness? Just saying yes to whatever is present. The poet Dorothy Hunt says, peace is this moment without judgment, this moment in the heart space where everything that is welcome. This is from the Chinese poet Lin Po, Li Po. The birds have vanished into the sky, and now the last cloud drains away. We sit together, the mountain and me, until only the mountain remains. Thank you. So today, what I'd like to talk about and share some reflections on is awakening. I wonder what comes to your mind when you think about awakening. Another term for awakening is enlightenment. And I'm sure for many, those terms may feel like, some very distant, far off goal, like for maybe for the Buddha and a few people through history have been able to awaken to, the full possibilities of this human life. But maybe you might have set a kind of a more modest goal. I just like a little less stress and anxiety in my life, a little bit more joy, a little bit more peace. And a wonderful thing is that that's our choice. We can set our objectives, wherever we want to, and if it's enough to just to have a little more peace, a little more ease in our lives, and that's our perfect right to set our objective there. But one of the things that can happen is we might set modest goals, but when we see, that I have really found peace. I've really found some peace by being able to maybe forgive somebody in my life or accept something that I normally wouldn't accept, how people are, or, how the world is. And we might be encouraged to further our goals. There's a quote from a saying from Ajahn Chah, the great 20th century Thai teacher of Jack Cornfield and others, who says, if you let go a little, you'll find a little peace. If you let go a lot, you'll find a lot of peace, a lot of well-being. If you let go, if you let go a little, let go a lot. If you let go completely, you'll experience complete peace, complete freedom. Your struggle with the world will be at an end. And it's really that complete letting go, which may seem like a very far off goal, but this is really what the all of the Buddha's teachings kind of center on this, on the possibility of waking up. What do we mean by waking up? In waking up, implicit in that is the sense that we've been asleep. You don't wake up if you haven't been asleep. And so what does it mean to be asleep? To be asleep, really, in the terms that we're talking about, in the spiritual terms, is we've been taking a certain reality to be the kind of the way things are. We've been accepting the suffering in our lives as well. Just that's just how things are, or that's just how I am. I have these urges. I want these things. I don't like these other things, and I just kind of organize my life around getting more of the things I like and getting fewer of the things that I don't like. But when we do that, then the Buddha would say that's not a path to happiness. That's a path to more suffering. You cling more, you suffer more, you get caught up in aversion more, you suffer more. So awakening really means waking up, coming to see things more clearly, and really seeing things so clearly that it leads to a letting go completely of clinging in our lives. And letting go of clinging is to ending clinging in our lives, whether it's kind of holding on to what we want, pushing away what we don't want. That leads to suffering. And when we let go of clinging, we let go of suffering. We find our way out of suffering. That's the heart of the Buddha's central teaching of the Four Noble Truths. I like to kind of put it in a pithy terms, in a bumper sticker, if you cling, you suffer. If you let go of clinging, you end suffering, Clinging leads to suffering. Ending clinging leads to ending suffering. So the Buddha taught, he said, talking about his teachings, he said, I teach one thing and one thing alone, suffering and its end. That all of the teachings are organized, all of his teachings were organized around ending suffering in our lives. And awakening is another way of saying the ending of suffering. In his own life, we're familiar with the outline of the Buddha's life, Siddhartha, life of comfort and luxury and living in palaces, but recognizing that's not going to provide him lasting happiness. Even in the midst of all the luxury, he would get sick, he would get old, and he'd die. So he left that life and searched, and his question really was, is there an end to suffering? Is there true freedom possible in this life? And he went, as you probably know, he went through various different practices that kind of took him down the wrong path, austerity, asceticism, but then realizing that, a middle path, what's called a middle path, a middle way, and sitting down under the tree, he saw into, what leads us, what keeps us in this cycle of suffering, what keeps us suffering. And that's what he formulated in his first teaching of the Four Noble Truths, basically the suffering that comes from clinging. And that when you let go of it, let go of suffering, you'll experience freedom. And he laid out in the fourth noble truth, a path to the end of suffering, a training in living ethically, training the mind, cultivating wisdom. And this is what he taught for 45 years, that freedom from suffering is possible. So for the Buddha, the question of awakening is the most important question in the world. There's nothing more important than waking up, because it's the difference between a life of happiness, a life of peace, a life of freedom, on one hand, or a life where we're caught up in suffering. It may not always be tremendous suffering. It may not be, suffering that's kind of grounded in, great hatred and violence and all of that, or greed. but it may be the suffering where, this we still haven't found what we're looking for, as the song goes, that we're still, things aren't quite, we're not quite where we'd like to be in our life. Probably all of us might think, well, you ask, is there anything that's missing in your life, or anything that's in the way of being truly happy? Most of us would probably find something, and that we haven't found the end of suffering. So the question of awakening for the Buddha was the most important question, really, to answer. In Zen Buddhism, they speak about practicing as though your hair was on fire. Practicing as though your hair was on fire, if we have any hair. But that sense of urgency. Nothing is more important than this. As one spiritual teacher, Adyashanti, some of you may know of him and his teachings, a wonderful teacher. He's practiced a lot in the Zen tradition, but his teachings aren't, within Buddhism per se, but are kind of more broad, what we might call non-dual teachings. I'll say something about that in a minute. But he says, Adyashanti says, our greatest contribution to humanity is our awakening. It is to literally leave the state of consciousness that the mass of humanity is in and discover the truth of our being, which is the truth of all beings. When we do this, we come back as a gift. We are, in a certain way, reborn. So the most important contribution to humanity is our own awakening. That when we're truly awakened, then we live in a different way in the world. We come from a place of compassion and engage in the suffering of the world wherever it's most needed. We can respond. So there's many ways that awakening can be described. The Buddha, I want to mention the Buddha's description of awakening after he sat under the tree and saw, into the truth about suffering and the end of suffering. He said, done is what was needed to be done. The work had been done, it was completed. He was fully awake, fully enlightened. And this is what has come down to us of what he said. Excuse me. Seeking but not finding the house builder, I travelled through the round of countless births. Oh, painful is birth ever and again. House builder, you have been seen. You shall not build the house again. Your rafters have been broken down. Your ridgepole is demolished too. My mind has now attained the unformed nibbana, or freedom from suffering, and reached the end of every kind of craving. So he speaks about house builder. The house building is the way we create suffering, by clinging. Clinging is the basis of building this house of illusion, if you like. And awakening is to awaken from this illusion. The illusion of that we can find happiness, outside of ourselves. That we can find happiness, for example, by getting more of the things we want, and pushing away the things we don't want. that illusion keeps us in the cycle of suffering. It keeps us going round and round in this cycle. So we have to, so awakening really is a breaking through out of this illusion, the illusion. And it's the illusion of a separate self, a separate self that comes out of clinging. If we're clinging to something, there's the sense of a me here wanting to be there, wanting to have this or wanting to get rid of that. And in that gap, there's suffering. In that clinging, there's suffering. So awakening is to see through that illusion of the separate self by letting go of clinging. So breaking away from the limited sense of a self separated from others, separated from the world, and opening to really a radically different way of seeing and being. Again, to quote, or to paraphrase, or to refer to Adyashanti, this a spiritual teacher, he speaks about awakening really as breaking out of the gravitational field of clinging, of suffering. It's like a rocket that goes outside of the Earth's gravitational field. And the freedom is to get away, get completely out of that gravitational pull of clinging that keeps us tied up to suffering. Because sometimes it's possible to have experiences of awakening, of real clarity, of breaking through, but we might get pulled back into our everyday life, into our habits and patterns that keep us caught up in suffering. So we get pulled back into the gravitational field, really, of suffering, of clinging and suffering. There's some wonderful stories of awakening. The Buddha's own story is a kind of archetypal, quintessential kind of story. It's the kind of most emblematic of example of awakening. Of just this transformation that took place, and the life that was lived after awakening. From up to the point of his awakening, the Buddha is just an everyday, obviously we called it everyday worldling. It sounds like from The Hobbit, or something, Lord of the Rings. Everyday worldling is how it's sometimes written in the discourses, in the teachings. But when he sees through the illusion completely, the illusions that keep us tied to suffering, he's then not referred to as Siddhartha, which was his name, Siddhartha Gautama. It's Gautama, the family name, but he's referred to as the Buddha. And the Buddha simply means the awakened one, the one who is awakened. And he teaches from that non-self, really, that clinging had been let go of, and in a sense, all that remains is the clarity, the wisdom, obviously in an embodied form, as long as he was alive, but without any of the habits and patterns that kept him tied to suffering. It can be helpful. Excuse me. It can be helpful to hear about some of the experiences of awakening. And just say before I share some of these, awakening can happen in a very sudden way. As a breakthrough. It can be, sometimes it might be, there's a lot of examples of in the Zen tradition of people working on koans. If you're familiar with koans, these paradoxical kind of, in a sense, they don't make sense in every day. What's the sound of one hand clapping, that kind of thing. Or show me your original face before your parents were born. Show me your original face before your parents were born. They don't have a kind of logical, rational answer. So the practice, if you do koan practice in Zen, is to just sit with the koan, sit with the question, and you tend to get more kind of tight, and you can't find the answer, but then what can happen is that something, the mind kind of drops to another level, and there's a realization and a kind of letting go that comes with it, with the with the practice. And it doesn't come through rational, logical ways. It really is a form of letting go. And there are many examples of people experiencing kind of deep breakthroughs to awakening through working on koans. But often it can happen just through, in unexpected kind of ways. I found my way onto this path 40 years ago, this year actually, through an experience of, I was being in a very, very tight place, and I'd been working hard and organizing and all this stuff. And it was like being, working on a koan, only it wasn't formally a koan. And I just had this experience of, I had a question, finding my way back to where I was staying in a place where I didn't really know quite where I was going. And it was like, did I go this way or this way? What's the answer? And then everything fell away, it kind of, and there was a kind of a voice as though from the center of the earth that said, just walk, just walk. And it was like enormous relief and release. And I just share that just because these aren't that uncommon, these experiences. But what that was for me was, it was enough to get me on the spiritual path. I happened to have been reading a Zen book. It wasn't as though the Zen book caused, that experience, but something was going on that it kind of maybe put a little bit of yeast in, that helped in some kind of a reaction. But what for me that experience was it got me on the spiritual path. It got me to really be interested in Eastern mysticism, Western, tradition, and all sorts of things. And I wandered around in the spiritual marketplace for a number of years afterwards, until I found my way to kind of more the Buddha Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha and Buddhist practices. But I share this. Some of you may be familiar with, obviously, with Eckhart Tolle and The Power of Now. Probably a lot of folks have read that. But he shares his experience, which is, an incredibly powerful one. It's a little long, so I'm going to shorten it a bit. But he begins by saying, until my 30th year, I lived in a state of almost continuous anxiety interspersed with periods of suicidal depression. It feels now as if I'm talking about some past lifetime or somebody else's life. He says, one night not long after my 29th birthday, I woke up in the early hours with a feeling of absolute dread. And he shares about this. He says, everything seemed utterly meaningless, and it created in me a deep loathing of the world. The most loathsome thing of all, however, was my own existence. What was the point in continuing to live with this burden of misery? Why carry on with this continuous struggle? I could feel that a deep longing for annihilation, for non-existence, was now becoming much stronger than the instinctive desire to continue to live. And he says, I cannot live with myself any longer. This was the thought that kept repeating itself in my mind. Then suddenly I became aware of what a peculiar thought it was. Am I one or two? If I cannot live with myself, there must be two of me, the I and the self that I cannot live with. Maybe I thought only one of them is real. I was so stunned by this strange realization that my mind stopped. I was fully conscious, but there were no more thoughts. Then I felt drawn into what seemed like a vortex of energy. It was a slow movement at first, and then accelerated. I was gripped by an intense fear, and my body started to shake. I heard the words, "Resist nothing," as if spoken inside my chest. I could feel myself being sucked into a void. It felt as if the void was inside myself rather than outside. Suddenly there was no more fear, and I let myself fall into that void. I've no recollection of what happened after that. I was awakened by the chirping of a bird outside the window. I'd never heard such a sound before. My eyes were still closed, and I saw the image of a precious diamond. Yes, if a diamond could still make a sound, this is what it would be like. I opened my eyes. The first light of dawn was filtering through the curtains. Without any thought, I knew that there is infinitely more to light than we realize. The soft luminosity filtering through the curtains was love itself. Tears came to my eyes. I got up and walked around the room. I recognized the room, and yet I knew that I'd never truly seen it before. Everything was fresh and pristine, as if it had just come into existence. I picked up things, a pencil, an empty bottle, marveling at the beauty and aliveness of it all. That day I walked around the city in utter amazement at the miracle of life on earth, as if I had just been born into this world. For the next 5 months I lived in a state of uninterrupted, deep peace and bliss. After that it diminished somewhat in intensity, or perhaps it just seemed to because it became my natural state. I could still function in the world, although I realized that nothing I ever did could possibly add anything to what I already had. So I share this as another very powerful example of somebody coming from a place of deep depression and on the point of taking their own life, and then realizing, having this experience of breaking through. And Eckhart Tolle has been teaching, from this awakening, from this understanding that came from that letting go for, it must be 30, 40 years now. Wonderful teachings really just opened up from that, from that experience of letting go. This is a possibility that is, that is open to us all. This is, and it's not what he wasn't particularly, as far as I know, wasn't a practitioner of any, any particular tradition. Here's another example from a well-known writer, Arthur Koestler, a robust and skeptical intellectual. This is from a book on an article on sudden awakening. He reported an experience when he was in a prison during the Spanish Civil War and he was facing execution. He says, "I must have stood there for some minutes entranced with a wordless awareness that this is perfect, perfect. Then I was floating on my back in a river of peace under bridges of silence. It came from nowhere and flowed nowhere. Then there was no river and no I. The I had ceased to exist. When I say the I had ceased to exist, I refer to a concrete experience that is verbally as incommunicable as the feeling aroused by a piano concerto, yet just as real, only much more real. In fact, its primary mark is the sensation that this state is more real than any other that has been experienced before. So another just example of the transformation that comes with letting go. And this awakening can come, out of the blue. There are many examples. I'll just share a couple of very brief ones. This is from a Zen teacher, John Tarrant. It says there's the story of a Jewish captive of the Nazis who was about to be executed and was overwhelmed with love for the world, including the man who was about to execute him. Ich liebe dich, I love you, he said, embracing his captor, and the embrace was returned and the execution forgotten. There's the one about the mountaineer who fell from a cliff towards his death, awakened on the way down, and full of joy even about his fall, was saved by a lucky bounce into a tree. There are many, many of these examples of something happen, something, and sometimes, and they can come out of practice, out of meditation practice, on a sitting or in a retreat, something just lets go. It's not that we do anything. It's, in a sense, it's an accident, it can be just a letting go that happens. And so awakening, there's been a lot of debate in history and Buddhism and related traditions about whether awakening happens suddenly or gradually. What's the relationship? Does it come through steady practice over many years, or does it just happen? Does it come, unexpected, unbidden, and in the way that Eckhart Tolle's example, or or the Arthur Kessler's, or many others. There's been a lot of debate around this question. One of the things I think you can say about awakening is that it's always a breaking through. It's always a breaking through from one way of seeing to another way of seeing, and it's not purely a kind of an incremental thing. It's somehow, quantity turning into quality, in the way that, at a certain temperature, water will turn into ice, and another temperature will turn into steam. The quality changes. There, in that example, it's the increments that will lead to the change. But with awakening, I think there's always a breaking through, out of our everyday way of seeing that keeps us in that kind of gravitational field of suffering, out of it, and leads to a letting go. And so there's important questions about awakening. I mean, one is how, can we practice to help us awaken? And I want to talk a little bit about, in the remaining time, about that. For hundreds of years, there have been debates within Buddhism and within other traditions as well, of whether awakening comes through practice, through gradually, through training and through practice. And the Buddha's path is a gradual path, isn't it? If you think about it, it's a path that leads to awakening. Awakening is the end of all of the path. It's the end of suffering. It's what all of the teachings focus on is ending suffering completely. But the path to getting there that the Buddha laid out is a path of training. And the training implies, I'm here and I need to be there, right? I'm suffering and I need to be not suffering. I need to be, or where I want to be is in a place where I'm not suffering. So inherent in the idea of practice and training is duality, is a two-ness. There's a here and there's a there. There's a now and there's a future. And the training is to get us there. So you can see the Buddha's path of training, particularly the Eightfold Path, as a gradual path leading to the end of suffering. But it doesn't lead, in a way that, like walking, if you're on a racetrack, let's say you're in a race for 100 meters or something, if you keep on going, you'll get to the place, you'll get to the tape and the end of where the race is. There's no guarantees that if no matter how much training you do, how much you train the mind through meditation, living skillfully, cultivating wisdom, there's no guarantee that awakening will happen. Certainly not in one lifetime. It may be, maybe in many lifetimes, but there's no ultimate guarantee that. And so it's not an incremental thing. It's better to think of it, it's more helpful to think of it as like tilling the soil, creating the conditions for a plant to grow. You can, give the soil all of the nutrients and the water and the sunshine, etc., that it needs, but it won't guarantee that a seed will turn into the plant. It won't guarantee that. But without those conditions, maybe there aren't, those conditions facilitate the development of the plant, but they don't in themselves make it happen. In the same way, the training, you could say, helps create the soil for awakening to happen, but it doesn't guarantee that it'll happen. So on one hand, you could practice diligently your whole life and not awaken, excuse me, not awaken fully. And on the other side of the coin, you could practice not at all and awakening can happen. It can just come out of nowhere. They say, I think as in Zen as well, they say awakening is a cosmic accident. A cosmic accident. It's a kind of a happening, but the conditions, you can do everything to help the conditions arise, but something has to happen that is a kind of a breaking through. The thing that you can say about practice, and again, they say this in Zen, they say, awakening is an accident, but practice makes us accident prone. So awakening is an accident. It ultimately happens out of a mystery. It's a mystery what leads to that breaking through. But the more we practice, the more we create the conditions to make it more likely for that awakening to happen. So that's certainly the argument that can be made for the progressive or gradual path of the Buddhist path. There's another, you might call it school, in a broad terms, of what are called non-dual practices. They're practices which are grounded really in a kind of a denial of the fact that, that of the value of the here and the there. I'm here and I need to get there. The non-dual teachings say that awakening is really who we already are, and we just need to see it. We just need to see it. It's not that we need to get somewhere where we're not, but we just need to see that we're already free. So these teachings, and there are teachings within the Buddhist tradition, particularly Tibetan Buddhism, practices of Dzogchen and Mahamudra, which really are kind of pointing to that that already awakened quality of heart, that each one of us, that it's like we're already awake, but there's a kind of a screen that blocks our awareness of it, that we're not seeing the awakening that's already here. So the non-dual teachings, and there are other traditions, particularly a tradition known as Advaita Vedanta. I write that name since it's a little complex name for those who aren't familiar with it. Advaita Vedanta, which comes out of the Hindu tradition, associated with teachers like Ramana Maharshi and Sri Nisargadatta, which very much, point to this already free quality, that we don't need to get anywhere. We just need to. It's often, just need to stop what we're doing. There's another contemporary teacher, wonderful teacher named Gangaji, who, as many of these teachers have done, practiced a lot in the Buddhist tradition, but doesn't see herself now as a Buddhist teacher, just as Adyashanti doesn't, but more as a teacher of awakening. She tells the story of having practiced a lot, of kind of the more gradual path of, got to get somewhere. And she went to see meet with her teacher, and asked him a question. She said her teacher was named H.W.L. Punja. He was affectionately known as Papaji. And she said to him, I want to be free of all my entanglements and misconceptions. I want to know if final absolute truth is real. Tell me what to do. And he said, you're in the right place. Then he said, do nothing. Your whole problem is that you continue doing. Stop all your doing. Stop all your beliefs, all your searching, all your excuses, and see for yourself what is always and always already and always here. Don't move forward toward anything, and don't move away from anything. In this instant, be still. And so his teaching was to just stop all of the doing. And this is, and for Gangaji, this was her awakening. And she saw and was able to kind of just drop into that awakened way of seeing, the freedom that came from letting go of the sense of a self that needs to get somewhere or get something. This dualistic sense of I'm here and I need to be somewhere else, which was explicit in her question. I want to be free of my entanglements. This sense of I'm here and I want to be there. And what he's saying is, let go of that sense that you need to be somewhere else and just be here. And so these teachings And I think much of, a great deal of their power is just the reminder that this freedom is right here, right now. And and all of the teachings of Gangaji, Toll, Adyashanti, and others are really just that reminder that peace. That the quote from Dorothy Hunt: "Peace is this moment without judgment, this moment in the heart space where everything that is welcome." That just right now. So it's just like in this moment, what is missing? Can I say yes to this? And if I can keep opening to what's here, and to experience the freedom that is here, always and already here, always present. This moment, maybe just to take a moment and stop the words, and just let your attention come to what's here right now. Just saying yes to whatever is here, this moment. Can this moment be a moment of true freedom? And just to keep coming back to that, coming back. So if your eyes are closed, just coming back, opening your eyes again, and just the last couple of minutes to say, these teachings appear to be kind of very contradictory, in a way, kind of not easily reconcilable. This sense of, the Buddhist path and other progressive paths of like, okay, train, let go of clinging, live a skillful, virtuous life, see as clearly as we can, be as present as we can. And it's always, the Buddha's teachings are always coming back to mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of the breath, mindfulness of feelings, emotions, mindfulness of what's here right now. So it's not as though, it's all about the future, but just to it seems a very different way of seeing this kind of sense of this training of the heart and the mind to create the conditions for awakening to happen, when it's ready to happen. And then this non-dual teachings, which are kind of invite a letting go of any of that sense of there's things that we can do to get to where we need to be, and just to recognize that the freedom that is here, that's always here right now. And I believe there's a great wisdom in each of these approaches, and that they ultimately they're not irreconcilable. Each of them have, like everything, can have a shadow side. The shadow side, the side that's kind of flips into ignorance. The shadow side of the gradual approach is to always think we've got to get somewhere, to keep going on the path to get to the thing out there. And we don't recognize that it's here right now. So that's the shadow side of it. My first teacher, I remember, gave a talk. He said, and the essence of it was like, people are always talking about being on the path, being on the path, being on the path. And he said, the point is to get off the path. The point is to get off the path. Awakening is getting off the path. Doesn't mean you practice, doesn't mean you go out and rob banks or anything. You still would do the practices, but you don't need them in the same way anymore because you see clearly. So getting off the path. So the shadow side is thinking that we've always got to do more of this. Oh, do some more courses, do some more retreats, some more doing, and we'll get to that place. And and that is a shadow side of it. But there's also the wisdom that, just like planting crops, we need to help create the conditions for those crops to grow, and for similarly for awakening to happen. So there's the wisdom and obviously the shadow as well. And in the non-dual teachings, the wisdom is, I think, the truth that freedom is always here right now, that we can keep coming back. We just recognize that we're here, and to make that our practice is just the seeing and just the being. Okay, here. And the shadow side of the non-dual practices is to kind of get it as a concept of like, yeah, I don't need to do these practices, all these things to get somewhere. I'm already here. But again, to quote Adyashanti, he says, it's one thing to say that everything is already heaven, that everybody is already awake. It's true, but as one Zen master said long ago, a fat lot of good that does you if you don't know it. The question is, do we know it? Have we realized it? If we have not, what is it that's causing us to perceive otherwise? So the shadow is to kind of get the concept of already free, but not to have really realized it in practice. So if we can hold both of these, if you like, these truths at the same time, the absolute truth of we're already free, with the relative truth of there are things that we can do to help us to realize and remember that freedom, which is who we already are, then that can be our practice of like recognizing the wisdom in both of those approaches, and not getting caught up in the shadow, in the shadow of either of these these ways or these approaches.